So you know how sometimes you see some illustration and like the first thing you think of is that's digital illustration. What I mean by that is it just looks unnatural. It looks a little bit weird. It looks clearly digital. A lot of people think digital illustration has to look a certain way. And obviously we've gotten past that, and the tools have become so sophisticated that your work can look the same whether it's analog or
I do watercolors.
digital. It's just a different tool. So that got me thinking about specific things that you can do to make sure your work doesn't look too digital. So I have a little list here that I thought I would go through. So the first thing on the list, which was also, I think, the biggest thing that helped me to quickly switch to working fully digital, and that's finding the right brushes or brush for you. It could be as simple as one brush. For me, it was pretty straightforward because I was just doing line work that my work is based on. It's just a pretty tight line work. It's got a little bit of a tooth to it sometimes, depending on what I want to do. But it basically just emulates a sign pen or like a flare, like a felt tip pen, anything like that. So once I found a brush that felt just like that, it was super easy for me to just start working digitally. Just a very minimal transition period. Now I know this can be hard finding brushes that will work for you, and you may think that there probably isn't something, but brushes are so sophisticated right now that you can control so many different things. And even if you're like a painter and you work with like oils and watercolors, the live brushes in Adobe Fresco are just mind-blowing. The way you can like activate them and the way they blend, and they look like you're painting in watercolor. The waters and colors blend together. Listen, I'm not a painter, but it's pretty magical. It's easy enough for me to say find the right brushes, but you know, that doesn't have to mean go out and buy a bunch of brushes, because that can be pricey, and it sucks when you buy a brush thinking it's going to work a certain way and it doesn't work that way at all. So what I would recommend is, if you're using Adobe Fresco, or if you're not using Adobe Fresco, you could get the free version, which I think gives you access to most of the brushes. Go through Kyle Webster's brushes. He's one of the best brush builders in the game, and he's been doing it for a very long time. And because he works at Adobe now, all of his brushes are available at no extra charge within Adobe Fresco. So you can just go through them, spend a day just playing with all the different brushes, and I guarantee you'll find a brush that works for your specific style. And even if you feel comfortable working digital, I would check out some of the brushes. There's some amazing ones in there, and he's making new ones all the time. All right, next on the list. I've talked about this one before, but I think this is a really important one. Set a minimum brush size for whatever illustration you're working on. The reason for this is because one of the biggest mistakes people make when they're working digitally is just taking advantage of the fact that they can zoom in infinitely and just draw detail and keep going tighter and tighter and more detail. And I think this is one of the things that makes work look so digital unintentionally. It's just got this hyper rendered feel to it that looks like, I don't know, beyond real or just bizarre because the line work is so tight. It also leads to like inconsistent line work, because you could be drawing something and then zoom in one area and be working and make your brush size really small, and then when you zoom out it just looks bizarre because you've got all this mix of different areas where the brush size changes or gets really small or is really big, and it doesn't look that natural. What I always like to keep in mind when I'm doing something digitally is like, is this something I could easily do traditionally? That helps it keep it in like a world that doesn't feel too weirdly digital. That said, maybe you want to embrace the fact that it's digital and do as tiny little detail as you can do. Go ahead, go for that. This is just my thoughts on like what I do to keep my work from feeling in what I view as too digital. You don't have to listen to me. What do I know? You might be able to draw better than me. Now this one is a controversial one maybe, but for me, this is something that I like to do, and that's avoid gradients. And I avoid gradients, like computer generated gradients, because they're not easy to reproduce traditionally. They also don't reproduce that well in print. And as a professional illustrator, oftentimes the work I'm creating is being printed and things. So gradients don't always translate that well. That doesn't mean I won't do like a gradation of tone. I'm just talking about like using a gradient tool and making a gradient. It can make your work look super digital. And again, if you want that, that's fine, okay? It's fine. The next two are sort of the same thing, but like if you use shapes within your illustrations, like you use a tool to make the shapes, like you make a circle selection and fill it in with a color or something like that, instead of just using them as they are, make the shape but then trace over the shape with your own line work, and that will allow you to have the structure of a perfect circle or whatever shape that you're doing, but it'll have that subtle imperfection from your human hand doing it. And the next one, again, is the same sort of thing. Like if you're putting type into your illustration, or like a word or something like that, set it and the typeface, but then trace over it for your illustration. That'll make it feel more cohesive and locked in. So this situation might be like if you have a sign in one of your illustrations and you want to put type on that sign, instead of just like drawing it willy-nilly, especially if you're not very good at lettering, or if you don't want it to have like an illustrated lettering look, like if you want it to just look like it's part of a scene, choose a typeface that looks close to what you're trying to get, and then just trace over it with whatever brush you're doing the rest of your illustration with. Then it'll blend right in and look like it's part of the drawing. I don't know if this one is specifically digital because it would translate to traditional as well. And it's also only applicable to people like me whose work is mainly line-based, but avoid using colors that are too dark that hide your line work. A teacher that I had, who's also an amazing illustrator, just one of the greatest people I've known, Murray Tinkelman, mentioned this to me at some point, and I can't remember exactly what his wording was, but he was sort of saying that there's like two different kinds of drawings. There's like a line drawing with color, and then there's like a color drawing. And I think what he meant by that was that when you're doing like a color drawing, doesn't necessarily have to be color, I guess, but it's like a rendered drawing where you're rendering shapes. But a line drawing is based on the lines are the main thing. The lines are important. So you don't want to hide those lines. The color is secondary in that situation. He worded this much better and it made a lot more sense when he's saying it. But what I'm getting at is let there be some contrast. Like don't have a dark brown behind a black line work so that the lines sort of get lost in there. And you want the lines to be seen. The lines are important. I have pick a minimum brush size on here again. I think it's a good one, but it doesn't need to be on the list twice. Oh, that was 5. That's 5 tips to keep your work from looking weirdly digital. Hope that helped.